Dear students, today we are going to study the differences between parliamentary and presidential forms of government. We have already studied the features of parliamentary form and presidential form. Now we are going to identify the differences. We start with the first difference, that is the forms of executive. In a parliamentary form, the executive has two dimensions, real and nominal. Real is the head of the government, who is the Prime Minister. Nominal is the head of the state, who is the President in India and the monarch in Britain. India and Britain being parliamentary forms of government. In India, the Prime Minister exercises all real executive powers in the name of the President. Whereas in a presidential form of government, there is no distinction between the real and the nominal executive. The President is both the head of the state as well as the head of the government, like in USA, which is a presidential form of government. The US President, as head of the state, performs all ceremonial functions and as head of the government exercises the real executive powers. We move on to the second difference, that is the relationship between the executive and the legislature. In a parliamentary form, the executive is formed out of the members of the legislature belonging to the majority party. I take the example of India to explain that after Lok Sabha elections, one Prime Minister and 70 to 80 ministers are drawn from the majority party, who forms the executive, that is basically the government. So effectively, this Prime Minister and Council of Ministers are first legislators, thereby they become executive. Their seat is in the Lok Sabha. Thus we can establish a very close relationship between the executive and the legislature. They work in close cooperation and coordination. But in USA, there is a total constitutional separation of powers between the executive and the legislature. The President of USA selects and appoints his executive heads, and they are separate from the Congress, that is the legislature. Congress is also not at all a part of the executive. Next, we move on to the third difference, which is regarding the tenure of the executive. In a parliamentary form, the executive has a defined and maximum tenure, normally of 5 years. But if the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers are defeated on the floor of the House, that is, a vote of no confidence is passed against them by the legislature, they have to resign before completion of the 5-year tenure. Whereas in a presidential form, the tenure of the executive is fixed. The President of USA, for example, has a tenure of 4 years. He cannot be voted out of power by the legislature. Only an impeachment proceeding can be done against the President by the Congress, but that too on definite and proved charges. Next is the point of responsibility of the executive towards the legislature. In a parliamentary form, the real executive, that is the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers, are responsible to the legislature. Suppose in India, the Lok Sabha can pass a vote of no confidence and thereby that leads to the resignation of the real executive. But in a presidential form, Ministers are responsible to the President. There is no question of the President being responsible to the legislature, as we have already learned that there is a total separation of powers between the legislature and the executive. Now we come to the character of the Council of Ministers. In a parliamentary form, the Prime Minister with his cabinet makes major policies, always keeping in mind their responsibility towards the legislature. But in a presidential form in USA, the ministers, they are called Secretaries of State. In USA, they are responsible to the President and works according to his dictates. The President even has a right to remove any Secretary of State anytime without assigning any reason. The last major difference between the two forms, that is on the point of political homogeneity of the composition of the executive. Parliamentary form. In a parliamentary form of government, the executive, that is the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers, all belong to the same political party. That is, they are homogeneous in nature. That is the majority party. They all belong to the same majority party. But in the case of India, there can be an exception when no single party gets a clear majority, then a coalition is formed with 2 or 3 parties getting the maximum number of votes. But in a presidential form of government, the composition of the President and his cabinet is not necessarily homogeneous, because the President chooses his ministers on the basis of merit and capability, not party affiliation. So, these are mainly the 6 basic differences between the parliamentary and the presidential form of government. I hope I have been able to give you a clear conception of the differences. Thank you, my dear students.